Hello, how do you do? Uh, Today I'm going to do something a wee bit different, not too different, because it will relate back to an overall philosophical message, I think. But I'm going to talk about the stories of Sisyphus and of Icarus, because generally people will have certain main takeaways from these stories that are true, but I think they're not quite weighty enough. Uh, they're not the takeaways that I would necessarily have of the stories. And for Sisyphus, it's basically a story that says, don't try to cheat your fate effectively, or don't try to be more than you could possibly be, in a way. And Icarus is more of a story about hubris and cockiness, generally, indulging and instant gratification. They're usually the way these stories get described, and that's the main takeaway for most people. And those are right, but we're going to get into maybe a little bit more that could possibly be useful for different people. We'll see. So, for those of you who don't know, the overall story of Sisyphus is he was a king, not so great a dude, and he tried to cheat death. And death came for him, but he chained him up, and death wasn't released until Ares came to help him. And he told his wife to leave his body unburied and not to perform any sacrifices when he died. And because of this, Sisyphus was able to come back and live a second life. He came back from the underworld, his soul, back into his body, and he lived a second life. But then when he died the second time, he was doomed to live an eternal bout of suffering by continually pushing a boulder up a hill only for it to roll back down. So he just keeps doing it. He doesn't have any choice in the matter, and it's pretty unfortunate for him. So it's decently obvious how you could get the don't cheat your finitude out of this story. The idea of acknowledging your limitations and accepting them is probably a huge theme. But I think the overall story of him after death indicates a few different things that maybe somebody could learn from. I don't know, but we'll see. Sisyphus obviously irresponsibly used his intellect to try to cheat death, so he gets punished for it, and he has to go through this eternal suffering. I mean, the existentialists don't describe it as suffering, but most people would look at this and think it's suffering. He pushes the boulder up the hill, and it comes back down, and everything he does is effectively useless. Every task he tries to accomplish ends up with no net gain. And so it's this unavoidable work with suffering, lack of thought, lack of any kind of progress. And the whole time, you could argue that he's getting stronger because of it. You can argue he's getting more resilient in his spirit because he doesn't really have a choice. Or at least you'd hope that would be the way that he might respond if this were inevitable. Okay, so that's the story of Sisyphus in a nutshell. Now, in a nutshell, the story of Icarus is mainly more about a dude, Daedalus. Daedalus was a master craftsman, and he's on the island of Crete with King Mino. Now, Mino is the dude related to the Minotaur, and so what ends up happening is Daedalus creates the labyrinth to trap the Minotaur. It's a labyrinth so complicated that nobody could find their way out on their own. He still doesn't like the Minotaur. King Minos' daughter doesn't really much like the Minotaur, and this dude Theseus comes to help, and good old Daedalus gives Ariadne, King Minos' daughter, a ball of yarn to give this dude so that when he enters the maze, he'll be able to find his way back out. So he kills the Minotaur. King Minos gets pissed. throws Daedalus in the maze with his son Icarus. Inevitable doom. You can't find your way out. That kind of sucks. But Daedalus is so crafty that he makes these wings out of wax and feathers for his son and himself to fly out of the labyrinth. But he warns his son before they go to fly that he can't fly too close to the sun or else his wings will melt and he'll plummet into the sea, and also not to fly too close to the sea, otherwise they'll get damp and he won't be able to stay up as well. Daedalus is he gets out, they both start flying, and Icarus goes hog wild, flies up close to the sun, and then plummets to his death by drowning in the sea, just like his dad had warned him. So people generally tend to take this as, oh, he's just flying in this moment of extreme ecstasy. It's like, oh, he's just indulging himself in this frivolous pursuit. But I think that's not necessarily the best way of interpreting it, or at least not the most functional. The reality is Icarus was given an entirely new capability that he couldn't have reasonably expected himself to ever have in his lifetime. His father's this mythologically good craftsman who was able to make something extraordinary. Like, think about the concept of flying at the time that they wrote this. It's wild. It's an imaginary concept. And so to expect a child to use that responsibly is ridiculous, but I digress. So he goes flying. He has this newfound crazy capability of flying. It's not just that he enjoys it so much, it's the indulgence in the ability. If you were able to do something new and crazy that nobody else was able to do, that would make you pretty excited. Not just in a superficial I'm happy sense. You could very easily think of this as more of a slow burn, indulging in your own ability. And so he succumbs to arrogance and comes too close to the sun and falls down, right? Whereas his father knows how to moderate himself and is okay. And so kind of some interesting symbolism I thought I might have noticed when talking about some of these different things is I thought it was interesting that like it's a boulder that Sisyphus is pushing. I mean, it's very earthy. You think down to earth, humbling. It could crush him at any moment. He could easily succumb to this boulder. And another way of thinking about it is like he's moving a miniature earth. It's a bit of earth. So if you think of this as like trying to move the world almost, it's going to come back down. It's going to fall back down on him. Versus if you look at like the sun in Icarus, it's the source of all light, and light gives way to anybody's vision or to the possibilities of life or knowledge in general. I mean, when people don't understand things, we often say they're in the dark about them. That's not a coincidence. So many ancient civilizations worship the sun. Some characterizations of even modern day religions have something very directly related to the light or the sun. There's let there be light. It's all over the damn place, right? So it's an important thing. And one way you can think of it is he's coming closer and closer to this. We could call it knowledge. We could call it his ability. He's flying around getting a bit too close to, right? It could be a blind pursuit of one's own ability. It projectiles you up towards this ideal, but at the cost of forcing you to plummet as a result. So if you excel in that kind of regard, with no regard for your own moderation, it will bring you down. So I don't think it's just related to arrogance. just the usual form of arrogance we think of where you think you're better than you really are. I don't think it's just thinking you're better than you really are. It's trying to come too close to the ideal. It won't serve you well. Whereas in the case of Sisyphus, he has no option to have an ideal. He's just marching forward, trying to push this boulder up. Inevitable fate. He's suffering potentially the whole time, and it's this useless task. Icarus has the opportunity to do something useful, to get himself out of Crete, to potentially live a life now that his father was able to help him out with this new technology. But he squanders it indulging in his own ability. So that's a serious issue, right? Daedalus can be thought of as the most responsible person in either of these stories. I mean, he was a good guy, helped out getting rid of the Minotaur. He tries to save his son. Even when he couldn't get rid of the Minotaur, at the very least, he found a way to trap it. He did so through all these different crazy craftsmanship and intellectual ways. But the whole time, everything had an end. Every bit of his intellect that he used was a means to an end. It was to accomplish a particular task. It wasn't just pure indulgence in his ability. It wasn't any matter of pride. It was to get something done. In the case of the Minotaur, it was to keep some people safe. In the case of helping Theseus kill the Minotaur, it's to get rid of that thing that creates the level of danger in the first place that needed to be contained. He's trying to help his son escape. All of these different things, there's a pretty well-defined, reasonable goal that's admirable to a certain extent. Whereas you look at something like Sisyphus, he's trying to cheat death. That's obviously not good. He gets punished for it. Or you look at Icarus, and it's just kind of the blind use of an ability. It's not just arrogance, thinking you are better than you really are, or looking for instant gratification. It's like an indulgence in an ability. It's like Icarus is now profoundly capable in one dimension, but suffering in many others. He's not a well-rounded enough or controlled enough personality where he can direct himself with his newfound capabilities, whereas Daedalus is. Daedalus is awesome, right? But not everybody can be Daedalus. Not everybody has that kind of intellect. He's not that relatable. And I don't think his story is terribly translatable to the average person, because the only reason he was able to transcend this essentially unsolvable issue was because of just how mythologically great he was. The idea is where do you put yourself on this spectrum of Sisyphus, who's doomed to do this task over and over again the same way, only to have it never change. There's no way out. You can't see any way out. It may not even exist. So you're just going to be doomed to this eternal struggle. And maybe there's a component of that that is inevitably true. And then you have, on the total other end of the spectrum, is, yeah, maybe you're not doomed to eternal suffering if you have a way out that you've been given potentially, and now you have this extraordinary ability, but the extraordinary ability almost consumes you, and then you plummet to your death. And in the middle, you have lovely little Daedalus, right? Who's just chilling. He's having a good time. He's figuring things out for people. He's having pretty much an inarguable net positive effect, at least in this story, on those around him. And he's able to moderate himself somewhere in between these two. So maybe we can't all be Daedalus, but maybe we can find somewhere in between these two extremes of dead Sisyphus and Icarus, where we can use creative solutions that we already have been blessed with in order to accomplish some sort of well-defined goal where our abilities are used for something functional that has a decent, well-defined purpose, versus having an extraordinarily well-defined purpose in pushing a boulder up a hill, but having it have no utility. It's the same thing over and over again. It's a net zero. We should try to find ourselves somewhere in between these two things. I think you could make a reasonable argument for that, where you're not just hustling so hard to get things done, seeing them as these inevitable tasks that maybe you never get any time to stop and think because you're given this metaphorically insurmountable amount of crap to deal with in your life. There's always something you could be doing. There's always something you could be doing. But the reality is if you're always doing something, there's the potential that you miss out on those creative solutions and the unique abilities that maybe you didn't even get rightfully, but at least now you can use them. But without being entirely consumed by them and being extraordinarily arrogant or one-dimensional. I think that's a better takeaway from the story of Icarus and Sisyphus. I think it's more than just don't cheat and don't indulge, don't be surface level arrogant. It's more than just that. It's almost like a cry for responsible, creative technique that's used to accomplish a well-defined but still meaningful and positive purpose, right? So take a step back and think, are the things that you are focusing on getting better at and focusing on having this extraordinary ability, what does it mean if you don't really practice it all that much, and if it consumes you, what you become, and you're in this reckless pursuit of an ideal and it ends up destroying you or potentially multiple dimensions of you, whereas you could just hustle and hustle and hustle and then have nothing to show for it. There's gotta be some in between there that anybody could find of any level of intellect, inherent capability. There's got to be something for everybody there, which is why it's unreasonable to think you could be dataless, but it's totally reasonable where you think you could be somewhere in between. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Daedalus in flying had this upper bound and lower bound of what he was supposed to do, where he wasn't supposed to fly so low that it would become damp, or so high that the wax would melt and he would fall down. That in and of itself seems to suggest a similar thing, but encapsulated in just that myth itself, it doesn't give the contrary explanation of why the lower bound is important. What constitutes the lower bound? And I think the story of Sisyphus adequately constitutes that lower bound, at least after death. I thought that was pretty interesting. Maybe this was totally obvious to people. If so, you know what? Whatever. Hope you enjoyed it anyways. Have fun. Bye-bye.